Scotland is most beautiful in the exact places where it is hardest to live. When the world imagines the Scottish Highlands and its remote islands, it sees castles lost in the mist, dark lochs, and perfectly empty green hills. But behind that postcard beauty lies a different reality. This is a story about how people live at the edge of the UK. It is a life organized not by the clock, but by the arrival of a single ferry, a sudden shift in the wind, or the brief hours the sea allows humans to leave the port. We are going to follow the invisible threads that keep these isolated communities alive. We will see how a simple box of food reaches a village store, how fishermen and crofters negotiate their daily survival with the weather, and why a small local pub serves as a vital institution against the crushing weight of isolation. We will also ask why the young people who love this land are often forced to leave, and why coming back is never just a matter of the heart. Look closely at these valleys. You will find stone walls without roofs, standing alone in the grass. They look as though they have always belonged to the wild. But this profound emptiness was not entirely created by nature. Why are these beautiful valleys so empty? What powerful force keeps the remaining people anchored to this harsh land? And will these communities have enough people left to survive the next generation? To understand how life persists here, we first have to understand how distance dictates every kitchen, every job, and every single decision. Scotland is home to roughly 5.55 million people, but this population and its workforce are distributed with severe inequality. To the north of the United Kingdom, where the freezing Atlantic Ocean relentlessly crashes against the North Sea, lies a deeply fractured coastline scattered with hundreds of isolated islands. The densely populated cities are crowded tightly together on one side, while the vast highlands, remote peninsulas, and ferry-dependent communities stretch out on the other. Here, distance is never just a geographical fact on a map. It is a harsh daily calculation with a tangible price. Down at the busy mainland port, the absolute lifeline of an entire island community is being carefully loaded onto a commercial ferry. Fresh food, essential medical supplies, and everyday parcels are strictly sorted by their final coastal destinations. Ultimately, the rough sea and unpredictable weather hold the final authority over whether this vital schedule remains intact or falls apart entirely. On the island, local shopkeepers and residents wait patiently for the boat to finally dock. We follow a single crate of fresh food as it rolls loudly across the wet metal pier, is quickly loaded into a small delivery van, and eventually fills an empty space on a village store shelf. A tired sailor closely reads a name written on a sealed box. A resident quietly collects a needed package for an elderly neighbor. Most of us only realize we depend on a complex supply system when the thing we are waiting for fails to arrive. But here, people must live with that acute awareness constantly. Yet the ocean is not the only force that dictates life. In Scotland, an entire day can change simply because the wind shifts. As the very first light of morning slowly breaks across the endlessly restless surface of the cold Atlantic, the new day always begins with a careful, silent calculation. Down at the quiet harbor, local fishermen stand patiently together, studying the exact direction of the biting wind before deciding whether it is truly safe to untie their heavy lines. Up on the heavily exposed hillsides, A crofter steps out into the damp chill to strictly inspect the overnight damage to the long wire fences. At the front door of a small stone house, young children carefully pull up the heavy zippers on their thick, waterproof jackets before stepping out into the freezing cold. By noon, the heavy rain begins to violently lash sideways across the open valleys. But here, the rain does not make the hard work miraculously disappear. It only decides what specific task must be tackled first, what can safely wait until tomorrow, and what is simply no longer secure enough to continue. Several small fishing boats remain tightly tied in the protected harbor, swaying gently against the rising tide. Essential goods sitting on the open pier are quickly covered with thick canvas tarps. A local family simply alters their afternoon plans, safely moving their chores indoors, but they never cancel the day. Evening eventually arrives. The heavy front door forcefully opens and quickly shuts against the howling gale outside. Wet coats are immediately hung next to the radiant heat of the glowing fire. Cold water drips slowly from heavy boots onto the wooden floorboards. The iron kettle begins to loudly boil as the strong wind continues to relentlessly batter the window glass. Perhaps growing up is the exact moment we finally stop waiting for a perfect day to start living. Yet, this profound ability to continuously adapt did not just appear naturally out of nowhere. It was patiently accumulated over many resilient generations, forged by surviving on a vast piece of wild land where the quiet landscape itself still boldly holds the silent traces of those who have already left. Let us place two completely different spaces side by side to truly understand how Scotland lives with its complex past. In the bustling streets of Edinburgh, ancient stone buildings are still filled with warmth and modern purpose. People live, study, and actively work inside a vibrant, growing city, holding countless invisible layers of time. There, the past is never merely displayed. It breathes as a living part of daily life. But out in the vast, wide-open Highlands, history is uniquely recognized not by what remains, but by what is missing. Look very closely at the lone stone walls standing quietly amid the wild grass. You will quickly see a doorway overgrown with thick weeds. The heavy roof has completely vanished. There is no longer any smoke rising from the cold hearth. At first glance, this structure simply looks like a beautifully romantic ruin, blending seamlessly into the majestic landscape. But this is never just a simple scenic relic. This was once a warm kitchen, a safe bed, and the humble starting point of a family. During the Highland clearances across the 18th and 19th centuries, many residents were systematically forced from their tenanted homes. Often, this was to make way for far more profitable sheep or deer estates. Families were violently displaced to the rugged coastlines, rapidly expanding cities, or entirely different continents across the ocean. While this deeply painful history is not the single explanation for the modern silence, it remains a crucial layer. Who were the people breathing life into these isolated walls? Why were they ultimately forced to leave their ancestral lands? And can this profound, lingering emptiness ever be reversed in a completely different form? But history is definitely not only kept in broken stone and empty fields. It also exists deeply in the quiet, necessary things people repeatedly do every single day, without ever thinking to call them traditions. At 5 in the morning, The yellow lights on the pier are still glowing against the dark. Fishermen move quietly, preparing thick ropes, empty plastic crates, and heavy gear. They check the wind, the tide, and the sea. The decision to leave the harbor is not a heroic act. It is a cold, calculated equation balancing income, safety, and generations of experience. A canceled trip means no money today, but sailing out into a storm is not always the right answer. A rough hand pulls on a thick rubber glove. A wet knot is tested one last time. Inside the cabin, a hot cup of tea vibrates gently on the table as the engine rumbles. The boat's lights slowly fade into the black water. By 7, a stone house further up the hill begins its day. A simple breakfast is laid out. Thick waterproofs are already waiting by the front door. Children quickly check their school bags while a parent carefully scrolls through the morning updates for ferry delays and road conditions. Going to school here might mean a long bus ride or even a ferry crossing. You notice the quiet routines: who sits in which chair, who finishes eating first, who leaves the table, and who runs back inside because they forgot their gloves. Mid-morning brings the most anticipated event, the arrival of the delivery van from the port. The small community shop receives its fresh food, essential supplies, and online parcels. A resident walks in to collect their own order and signs for a neighbor's box as well. An ordinary item that takes a day to arrive in a city has crossed multiple transit lines to get here. Who covers that extra shipping cost? How is the fresh food kept cold during the crossing? What happens to these shelves if a winter storm cancels the boat for 3 straight days? Out on the exposed croft, the daily physical labor continues. A crofter wrestles a heavy metal gate open and clicks it firmly shut. They check the sheep, repair a section of wire fence snapped by the wind, and haul bags of expensive winter feed. This is not a romantic painting of a shepherd on a green hill. It is an exhausting mix of physical endurance, rising diesel costs, and endless paperwork. A broken tractor part can stall an entire week of progress. Through the afternoon, the small, invisible systems that keep the village functioning are in motion. Neighbors share a ride to the clinic. A repairman navigates between scattered houses. Someone feeds the dogs for a family away on the mainland. The post office acts as a vital social hub, not just a place for stamps. Evening falls. Food, sourced from the cold sea or the nearby fields, appears on the dining table. Wet coats are drying. Hot tea is poured. Daily news is shared, usually circling back to tomorrow's weather or the ferry schedule. Many of us can buy almost anything with a few taps on a screen. But the less we see the journey of a meal, the easier it is to forget how many humans it took to bring it to the table. The night settles inside the local pub. A heavy wooden door opens. A resident is instantly greeted by their first name. A wooden chair is pulled out. Someone asks why a familiar face hasn't shown up today. When a community relies on so few people to run everything, what happens if the younger generation does not return? To understand why someone might stay or be forced to leave, we must look at how money actually moves across the sea, the land, and the houses. Follow the journey of a single marine catch to deeply understand how daily physical survival translates into hard currency. The fishing boat finally returns to the harbor after a grueling shift. The heavy load of shellfish is hoisted ashore, carefully weighed and rapidly sorted on the wet docks. A very small fraction enters the local cold chain, but the vast majority is quickly packed into refrigerated trucks and shipped far away from this coast. The money generated from this catch must efficiently flow back to pay for the vessel, the constantly rising cost of diesel, the heavily damaged gear, and the grueling manual labor. But does the fisherman sell directly or through distant corporate buyers? Where is the final market price actually decided? When a severe winter storm grounds the entire fleet for weeks, how does that sudden stop affect the community's fragile cash flow? And does the younger generation still want to inherit this brutal, unpredictable profession? On the land, the financial reality is just as stark. A crofter diligently manages the rocky soil and livestock, but their raw products must survive expensive ferry transport, distant mainland processing, and highly complex distribution networks. Distance strictly increases both time and overhead. The final premium price tag on a mainland supermarket shelf rarely reflects the actual money the original producer receives. Every single mile of distance silently eats away at the thin profits meant to sustain their rural family. Yet, there are certain local products that simply cannot be forcefully rushed. The famous Angel's Share, the portion of whiskey quietly lost to natural evaporation as it slowly ages, is a perfect metaphor. The true value of this world-renowned export comes from humans willingly accepting the weight. It is a slow, deliberate accumulation of raw ingredients, heavy physical labor, imported oak barrels, and the sheer patience of time. Today, modern economies bring entirely new questions to these remote shores. When seasonal tourists arrive, where does the revenue actually stay? Are the local jobs created enough to securely support a year-round life? Are the local houses serving permanent residents or short-term guests? Massive renewable energy projects generate incredible offshore power, but what does the local community truly receive in their daily lives? Look at the massive offshore turbines spinning endlessly in the fierce ocean breeze. Now, look at the expensive energy bill sitting on the kitchen table inside the croft, while that exact same wind violently batters the stone roof overhead. Whether the money comes from the unpredictable sea, the stubborn land, or visiting tourists, a remote community cannot survive on mere income alone. To truly endure, it also deeply needs the warm spaces that make people feel they belong. Culture does not survive in a museum. It survives only when there is still a place, and still enough people, to actually practice it. Follow the harvest from the freezing sea and the windy pastures straight into a warm local kitchen. A hot, hearty soup is slowly ladled into deep bowls. A pot of strong tea is carefully poured. These specific meals are preserved not just for their taste, but for the profound circumstances that surround them. A bitterly cold day, a family member finally returning safely from the mainland, or a recipe followed entirely from a grandmother's fading memory. Down the road, the local pub functions as vital social infrastructure. It is not merely a place for a casual pint. Watch as the owner unlocks the heavy wooden door. Watch the local residents claim their highly familiar chairs. Daily news is eagerly traded. Someone specifically asks about a neighbor who hasn't shown up. A newcomer is introduced, though it is true that in such a tightly knit space, privacy is rare and true belonging takes time. Suddenly, traditional music begins in the corner without any grand stage. Traditional symbols like the kilt, the ancient tartan, or the bagpipes are not worn here for passing tourists. They appear naturally during highly genuine community moments, a local wedding, a quiet memorial, or a seasonal village festival. Even the Gaelic language remains a living, breathing entity here. Over 130,000 people across Scotland still possess some level of Gaelic skill, and for the first time in many decades, the number of fluent speakers is finally growing. You hear it playing on the local radio, read it on the bilingual road signs, and catch it in the quiet, intergenerational conversations over a low stone wall. Perhaps what we deeply fear losing most is never just a physical building. It is a place that once knew exactly where we would sit. But a shared, welcoming room can only continue to keep its warm lights on when there are still enough people left to gather around the table. A young child slowly grows up completely surrounded by the tight-knit warmth of a small island community. The local school and highly familiar neighbors create a profound, unshakable sense of belonging. But as they finally reach adulthood, the available paths for higher education and diverse careers drastically narrow. These young people do not leave out of a lack of love for their deep heritage. They leave simply to build a viable future for themselves. Years later, many of them deeply yearn to eventually return. Yet, actually coming back requires much more than just pure nostalgia. It demands stable year-round employment, reliable transport, and, most critically, a physical roof over their heads. Recent official data explicitly reveals a deeply harsh modern reality. While these islands hold merely 2% of Scotland's total housing stock, they contain a staggering 17% of the nation's second homes. 7 in 10 island residents currently report that local housing fails to meet community needs, with over half agreeing that affordable homes are simply out of reach. This struggle is not a simple villain story of wealthy outsiders buying up properties. It is a highly complex crisis, fueled by inflated building costs, expensive material transport, and a severe lack of supply, fiercely clashing with lower local wages. While population trends actively fluctuate differently across various islands, the central structural barrier remains entirely the same. Like them, many of us have left our own hometowns to build a better, brighter future. Only years later do we finally understand that this distant future does not always keep a clear, welcoming path open for us to return. And as staying inevitably becomes increasingly difficult for the young, the empty valleys of the past begin to ask a completely new question of the present. Let us return once again to the lonely stone walls standing quietly in the tall green grass. We now deeply know this profound emptiness carries a very heavy, tragic history. In places like Shiaba on the Isle of Mull, over 140 residents lived peacefully together before almost the entire community was ruthlessly evicted in 1847. Further inland lies Glencoe, a truly majestic valley world famous for its breathtaking natural beauty. Yet, its absolute deepest memory is tied directly to a brutal betrayal of sacred Highland hospitality, where a cold stone monument still actively remembers the innocent MacDonalds who perished in the freezing winter of 1692. The stunningly beautiful landscape is no longer just a scenic backdrop. It has become a vast, silent vault where complicated memories are carefully preserved long after the original houses and the native people have vanished forever. Today, the modern emptying of the land happens much more quietly and invisibly. There are no sudden eviction orders, forcefully demanding families to suddenly leave. Instead, a tight-knit community slowly shrinks through a steady series of extremely quiet losses. A local house that a young couple simply cannot afford to safely rent. A vital job that sadly only exists in the busy summer. A delayed ferry that completely disrupts the entire working week. Or a rural classroom that inevitably loses just one more student. Recent official indicators clearly show that while the deep feeling of community remains incredibly strong, the perceived reliability of essential public transport is now steadily slipping away. We place massive wind turbines, passing tourists, and beautiful holiday homes right next to a struggling family desperately needing a permanent roof. A remote shop desperate for local workers, and a village school desperately needing young children. We must carefully ask ourselves, this immense economic value being generated here will ultimately help who to continue safely living here? We often look at an entirely empty place and quickly call it peaceful. But silence does not always mean that no one was ever there. Sometimes, it is simply what is left behind after a once vibrant community no longer has the fundamental conditions required to successfully survive. The Scottish people have never been able to stop the fierce wind from continually blowing. The only crucial question remaining now is who they will harness that immense power for today. Look closely at the end of the day, when the wind finally settles into a steady hum. It is in these ordinary, quiet moments that the true strength of this land is revealed. A heavy wooden crate of supplies is carefully handed off a swaying ferry by tired hands. A dripping wet raincoat is quietly hung up beside a glowing fire. Someone pauses in the freezing cold just to hold a heavy door open for the person walking behind them. Inside a dimly lit pub, a familiar chair is pulled out, waiting for a neighbor. One by one, the warm yellow lights inside the scattered stone houses turn on against the dark. Far offshore, a massive turbine slowly spins, capturing the very gale that makes life here so difficult. These isolated places do not preserve their unique identity by keeping everything completely untouched in a museum display. Their culture is fiercely recreated every single day. It survives through the countless small, deliberate actions that allow people to continue to live, to physically work, and to still recognize each other in a rapidly changing world. To survive here is to constantly learn how to stand firmly in the wind. If a true home is not just the geographical coordinates where we happen to be born, but a space where there is still enough room, enough opportunity, and enough warmth for us to safely return, we must ask ourselves a final question. What must a fragile community fight to keep in order to continue being called a home? Tell us in the comments below about a specific place that truly made you feel seen and recognized, or somewhere you still hold on to the quiet hope of returning to one day.